Hi, and welcome to this lecture on the biological sciences. So this is the last of the substrands of science understanding that we'll be covering in this course. So that constitutes the entire body of content knowledge that you will actually require. So in regards to the content, these are some example learning objectives that can actually fall out of these things. So these, you'll remember, are the content descriptors from the Australian Curriculum Science, and in particular from the biological sciences substrand. So what I've done there in red, I've actually highlighted the various pieces of the various concepts that we'll be dealing with in each of those year levels. So in summary, in year 7, students there will be learning about taxonomy and ecology. In year 8, this focus switches over to the cell and the cell theory, organelles of the cell, and also organ biology, in particular a few key human systems. In year 9, we start to look at physiology, in particular homeostasis, and we pick up that theme of ecosystems and we develop it further from the year 7 treatment. And then in year 10, we have a look at genetics, now in particular Mendelian genetics, and also the theory of natural selection by evolution. So that is the entire biological substrand for junior secondary. Okay? Now, what you can see here are only one learning objective from each one of these content descriptors. For each of these content descriptors, there are many, many more learning objectives which you could develop. But these are just some of the most basic basic ideas within those much larger concepts that we are laying the foundations for in your pre-service teacher training course. So while this might only be one learning objective for each one of those content descriptors, their purpose is to serve as a solid foundation to actually start that web of knowledge that you're going to build throughout your studies here at university, but then continue that process. You're going to keep adding more and more knowledge to that concept map that is building in your brain in each of the content areas in the pedagogy and technology that will comprise your teaching toolkit. Okay, so let's get started. So the first topic that we're going to have a look at is taxonomy. And so what I want you to be able to do here is to be able to explain how taxonomy has evolved over time. Now, taxonomy really just comes from the word taxa meaning group, and onomy meaning the study of. So really this taxonomy is the study of putting things into groups. Now, because this is biology, the things that we are putting into groups are living things. Now, if we rewind the clock all the way back to Aristotle's time, Aristotle and the ancient Greeks would take all known living things at the time and classify them into two broad categories. Things were either plants or animals. Now, if you stood still, if you didn't move around, then you'd be classified as a plant. However, if you're able to move around, then you'll be classified as an animal. So really what we're talking about here is the property of motility, whether you can move by yourself, so for example animals where we are motile, or whether we are sessile like plants are. Now there are a few interesting the consequence of having that first level of division being whether things are motile or sessile really presents a few problems. So for example, fungi would be classified as a plant under this Aristotelian classification system, and so would limpets, and so would a lot of those mollusks which cling to rocks. Corals would also be classified as plants. Now, they don't belong in the plant kingdom like we understand today, but back in Aristotle's time, that would have been the case. So you can see we've divided things into whether they can move about by themselves or they are stuck in one place. Plants are then strangely classified as being small, medium or large. So that essentially boils down to trees, bushes and grasses. And that in itself presents a few problems. When we have a look at the animal classification, the classification there is where the animal lives, so whether predominantly on the land, in the water, or in the air. Now, the problem with this is that bats and birds will be classified as in the same category, whereas now we actually classify those in two quite separate categories. So that was one of the first attempts to classify the living things that were around us. Linnaeus took that major theme of there being animals and plants, and he developed his own system, the Linnean classification system. And it is, by and large, the classification system that we still use today. However, rather than classifying things according to whether they are motile or sessile, he decided on different criteria. And so this was the first scientific attempt to really nut down the diversity of life on the planet and start classifying them in some way, because it's through classification that we can start to identify patterns, and through patterns we can develop further understanding there. Okay, so in Linnaeus' time, 1735, the microscope hadn't been invented, so the whole microscopic world hadn't been discovered. Well, that changed by the time that Haeckel came around, because by then, the microscope had been invented and we had discovered things like protists. I'm not quite sure whether bacteria had been discovered at that stage, but the first microscope makers actually found protozoans, for example, when they would scrape the plaque off their teeth and put that underneath the microscope, and they could see things moving around. Well, it reminded them of animals because they could move, hence the zoa part of the protozoa. So fast forward again to Chatton, and we then start to realize, oh, some of these unicellular organisms, they're actually quite different because they don't seem to have a well-defined nucleus. So that's where we start to get that division of prokaryota, organisms without a well-defined nucleus, versus eukaryota, which we belong to. So there are protists, single-celled organisms, which belong to eukaryota. Plants belong to eukaryota. Animalia belongs to eukaryota as well. Fast forward again, we then decided to split, well, okay, eukaryota is way too big a group, let's split that out into the three, and by the time that Whittaker came along, we had a deeper understanding of the cellular differences between plants and fungi, and therefore we divided those two, and it really came down to the composition of the cell walls, which differentiated the two. Not to mention that one is a heterotroph and plants are autotroph, but never mind, okay? So fast forward again, we get to Woese et al. Now, if we look at the 1990 classification, what we have is the concept of domains appearing for the first time. So domains is a level which is above the level that Linnaeus started at. Linnaeus started at the kingdom. Well, Woese has gone above that to create three categories. So the eubacteria, so they are the new bacteria. They're known as the bacteria in the 1990 classification system. And then archaebacteria became archaea. Now, archaea is a bit of a misnomer because it implies that archaea came before bacteria, when actually not the case. Okay. Now, there are two more modifications that you can see here by Cavalier-Smith, but the classification system that we generally stick with is the three domains and then the kingdom classification system of Linnaeus. So let's have a look at what that actually looks like. So because this is biology, we restrict ourselves to studying life. Okay. So down in the primary school, part of the biological sciences syllabus there has students actually figure out, well, what are the characteristics of life? If I'm looking at something, what criteria do I use to say, oh yes, this is part of biology, I can study this. That's done down in the primary school, and they have a great mnemonic called Mrs. Green that I recommend that you actually look into. So with the classification system the most popular classification system at the moment is where we get all living things. We divide that into 3 groups, into bacteria, into archaea, and eukaryota. Okay? So we belong to eukaryota because we have a well-defined nucleus, as well as some other cellular-based criteria, which we use to differentiate at the domain level. Now, within domain eukaryota, we belong to the Animalia kingdom because we're animals. Within animals, because we've got a backbone, we belong to Chordata, the phylum Chordata. Because we have mammary glands, we belong to the class Mammalia. Because we have hair and we're kind of like ape-like, we belong as all monkeys do in the primate order. And then other characteristics determine that we're in the family of Hominidae and the genus of Homo and species Sapiens. So you can see there the levels going from kingdom all the way down to species. Now there are a variety of mnemonics that you can use to remember these. So for example, one of them is dumb, king, phil, class ordinary families as generous and special. Now there are a whole range of mnemonics. If you've learnt a different one, then by all means keep learning that one and go ahead and teach that one. But if you don't know one, then just jump on the internet. There are a squillion of them. So before we move on to phylogenetic classification, the basis of Linnean classification is grouping into taxa or groups. Yeah? So life is one big group, and then that's divided into 3 domains. Those 3 domains are divided up in kingdoms and so forth. So Linnean classification is very grouped based. Now there are other elements of the Linnean classification system that we won't cover in this lecture. For example, he was the person that invented the binomial nomenclature. That is where we name organisms by a 2-part name, genus and then species. Now, we don't have time to go into that because really I want you to wrap your head around a much larger grouping system. Now, the Linnean classification system, which is group-based, is in contrast to phylogenetic. Now, phylo meaning tree or leaf, and genetic obviously referring to the genes. So this is where we use a genetic basis for putting things into groups, and we've put them into trees, into genetic trees. Now, one of the key advantages of phylogenetic trees is they are able to show common ancestors. Not only are they able to show common ancestors back in time, but they can also indicate the time sequence of when groups diverged. Okay? And this is how we get that thing called the tree of life. So if we have a look at this phylogenetic tree, do I have a cursor? No, I don't have a cursor. Rightio, if we have a look at this phylogenetic tree, we've got this branch here suggests that animals, plants and fungi pretty much separated around the same time. Okay, they split off into those 3. Prior to that, the ciliates had branched off. So if we talk about that juncture, so there was a group of organisms, and then a bunch broke off and became the ciliates, and then a little bit later on, that remaining group actually split into 3 and became animals, fungi and plants. Now if we trace that all the way back, so these guys, the flagellates, the trichomonads and so forth, all the way down here. So we broke off with archaea at that point. Go back even further down here, we have what's known as the last universal common ancestor. So this is what we presume to be the original organism that more than likely presided in the primordial soup. So it was from that group of individuals that gave rise to bacteria, to first of all, and then to archaea, and then eventually to us, yeah, up here. Yeah? So what's really good about this is that it shows common ancestry, whereas when we look at Linnean classification, that's not as obvious. there's a time sequence indicated by the distance between branches and nodes, and also it shows more accurately the tree of life. So on that tree of life, there are a whole range of representations, and that notion of the tree of life goes all the way back to Darwin's early writings. And in fact, there's quite a famous sketch that he drew of this whole this process of speciation. Now, this is quite an old one. I think this one's by Haeckel. And funnily enough, man is placed at the top. That one over there that you can see is a bit more colourful, it's a bit more modern, but it's a truer reflection of the reality, of the diversity of life. And you can still kind of make out that tree notion, but it's a lot more branchier than that. Branchier still is this one here, which shows even more organisms. So each of those notches around the edge of that circle denotes a different species. So you've got all the major divisions, you've got fungi, animals, plants, and so forth, but it's a really, really big map. Now, my favourite representation is this one here, because not only does it show the time sequence, but it also shows extinctions, which is really cool. So the way that you read this is that this is the start. You read this from the middle, that middle point, and you read outwards. Okay, so if we have a look at the Earth, so time is so the Earth is just born. And the very first organisms that appear, now my finger will disappear, is the bacteria. Yeah? So it wasn't long after the birth of the Earth that bacteria appeared. And they've been around ever since. Yeah? So bacteria first appeared, and then the next group of organisms to appear was the archaea. So that's where I was talking about the whole notion, the naming of archaea. Archaeans as archaea is a misnomer, because you would think that they were before bacteria. Not the case. Okay, so all of the unicellular life, bacteria and archaea, appeared first, and they are still around. The vast majority are bacteria, and archaea making up the other portion of the single cells. Yeah. So then we move into eukaryotes. So these are the organisms with well-defined nuclei. So they include the protists, for example. So they appeared next in the geological record. Then plants appeared next. Keep moving along, and so this is where we get that division of plants, fungi, and animals appearing. So keep moving out. Now, wherever you see these gaps in the tree, and there's one over here. This one over here is the extinction of the dinosaurs. So as we're moving out from here out to here, that's about 65 million years ago at that KT boundary. So that big gap there is the dinosaurs disappearing off the face of the Earth. Well, the big ones anyway. So those gaps in that those ecological niches were then filled by the mammals. So you can see here the mammals. Mammals started all the way back here, kind of just hid in the background for a bit, keep hiding. All of a sudden dinosaurs disappeared. That opened up the world, and then we mammals started to flourish. Okay? So it doesn't really matter which representation you actually prefer, whether you like it classic, colourful, more accurate. However, it doesn't really matter. But the important point here is to be able to read and interpret these diagrams. Okay, excellent. Rightio. So let's talk about kingdom Animalia, because more than likely these will be the groups that you'll be talking about in class. Now, the reason why we start with animals is because we're using the constructivist notion of moving from the familiar to the unfamiliar. Now, if we had started with bacteria and archaea, they are just well beyond the real world of many students in terms of studying them and so forth, whereas animals are much more likely to be in the realms of experience for our students. So we generally tend to start with animals. Now, if you have a look at this classification system, we've got vertebrates and invertebrates. Now, you'll see a lot of this on the internet and also in textbooks. However, it conveys a misconception. It conveys the misconception that firstly, we break things into vertebrates and invertebrates, and then the vertebrates are broken down that way, and then the invertebrates are broken down this way. Now, that's not quite the case, and I'll get to that in a moment, okay? What I want you to take away from this visual here is, just by looking at this classification system, what I want you to do is to decide how has the author of this piece of text, how have they decided to divide up reptiles, fish, amphibians, birds, and mammals? How have they decided to divide up the invertebrates, going from protozoa, flatworms, annelids, and then the arthropods, and so forth, okay? So that's the activity that I want you to do here, because what's more important is that you can deduce the criterion which was used to put these organisms into these groups, okay? Now, just to show you how a little bit off this all is, yeah, protozoans, they actually belong in another kingdom, yeah, so these guys, coelenterids, flatworms, annelids, the echinoderms and mollusks, they are all phyla, whereas these group over here, these are all classes of chordata. So this is kind of a simplified version of how animals are classified. The reality is this, yeah? So what we've actually got are the phyla. So you'll notice some of the invertebrate phyla in the previous slide. Up here you've got the flatworms, roundworms, echinoderms, and so forth. And then we've got the arthropods, yeah? Arthropods being broken down into subphyla and then into classes, yeah? So, and then over here, so this is our branch here. So we've got the vertebrates, chordata, sorry. These are the vertebrates, and then they're broken down into these group down here, yeah? So this is really just to show you that while you'll get representations like this virtually everywhere, and more than likely in the textbook that you'll be teaching from, just understand that the reality is that we actually classify the groups that we study into phyla or into classes. And so just have that in the back of your mind, and you might want to mention that to the students as well, okay? So now, if taxonomy is a new topic to you, then I definitely recommend that you go ahead and check out these two videos. And actually, before we go on, this is a video down the bottom here. So that compare and contrast the phylogenetic Linnean classification, that's a video, and that directly relates to the learning objective for that portion, okay? Right here, so that's taxonomy. Now, all of these areas are really quite huge, and we're really just picking off the main concepts in each area. So in taxonomy, you have to understand the differences between Linnean and phylogenetic classification, and also the levels within Linnean classification, because you're going to have to teach it, okay? When we turn our attention to ecology, one of the main things that you need to wrap your head around is the idea of food webs. Now, here's an example of a food web, and what all food webs do is they show two things: the feeding relationships within an ecosystem. So herbivorous insects eat plants, spiders which are eaten by spiders, which are eaten by insectivorous birds, which are eaten by snakes. So what I've just traced out there is a food chain, okay? So insects eat grass, spiders eat insects, birds eat spiders, snakes eat birds, yeah? So that is a food chain. Food chains, a number of food chains make up a food web, which is this whole thing. So you can think of it as showing the feeding relationships, but what it more accurately shows is the flow of energy through an ecosystem, okay? So that's another key point in ecology, is that energy flows through an ecosystem, and the food web shows that, how the energy flows from plants to the first layer, to the second layer, third layer, and fourth layers of the food web. Okay? Now, there are actually names for each of these layers. So at the bottom, the organisms which are able to produce their own energy are known as producers or autotrophs. Okay? Now, incidentally, where they get their energy from is from the sun. So if you're a terrestrial ecosystem and you're a photosynthete, more than likely you are in this layer here, and this constitutes about, I don't know, 95 plus % of the ecosystems on Earth. They are very much all solar based. There are a couple of exceptions. They're all the way down the bottom of the ocean and they have black smokers and are really cool ecosystems. But let's just deal with these ones here. Okay? So you've got the first layer, which are the producers. Now, producers are generally plants, and if you're an organism which just eats plants, then you're what's known as a herbivore. Now, because they are the first level above the producers, another name for them are first order consumers. Okay, so rabbits, squirrels, mice, these birds, these insects are all first order consumers. Now, if you eat a first order consumer, then not surprisingly, you are known as a secondary consumer. So second order or secondary consumer. If you eat a secondary consumer, then you're a tertiary or a, what would it be? A third level, yeah? And then if you eat one of those, then you'd be considered a tertiary, we've already done tertiary, a quaternary consumer, okay? So we've got consumers from here upwards, and we've got the producers down the bottom. And so this, this forms the basis of a food web, okay? Now, it's all well and good to be able to draw food webs, to be able to point to third order consumers, to point to autotrophs and heterotrophs, but what's more important is that you can use this to analyse the impact of adding or removing a species. Okay? So what I want you to do is I'm going to pose a couple of questions and then I want you to answer them, okay? So I'll do the first one, and then I'll give you some questions to practice on your own. So for example, if I remove the spiders, yeah, so get rid of the spiders, what will happen to the other organisms of the food web? Well, if I got rid of the spiders, then there'll be more herbivorous insects. If there are more herbivorous insects, then there'll be more predaceous insects, yeah? If I kill the spiders, then insectivorous birds, they will eat more of the predaceous insects because that's one of their food sources, yeah? So, what they'll do is they'll resource switch. So stop eating spiders, eat more of these guys, eat more of these guys, yeah? So if they are eating more of these, yeah, then more than likely, then they will have impacts upon foxes, hawks and owls because insectivorous birds are eaten by that quaternary level, okay? Rightio. So hopefully what you can see is how the impact of removing or introducing an organism ripples all the way throughout the ecosystem. Okay? Now, those ripples are especially felt when they are at the top of the food chain with apex species. Now, generally, they are predators at the tops of food chains, so we tend to call them apex predators. And Steve Irwin was a big proponent of apex predators and needing to protect them because of phenomena known as trophic cascade. Okay? So, for example, if we got rid of the foxes, then we would have explosions of rabbits, squirrels, mice, seed-eating birds, and also insectivorous birds. If their populations explode, then the amount of biomass, plant biomass at the bottom of the food chain will also suffer. Yeah? And so if plants are being overpredated, that's going to affect these guys over here. So if that's going to reduce their numbers, that's going to reduce these numbers. So hopefully what you can see is that it doesn't matter which part of the ecosystem that you ping. Once you ping any part, it ripples all the way through. And when you ping the top, it has even more drastic consequences. Okay? Excellent. So now, we've tried to apply this piece of knowledge of trophic cascade in a number of case studies around the world where we've had a degraded ecosystem and we've reintroduced an apex predator to bring back balance to that ecosystem. Now, the most famous one, and is widely reported, is the reintroduction of wolves back into Yellowstone National Park. So what I want you to do is to watch this video, and it's about from halfway that the narrator gets into the actual case study. But what I want you to do is to flow diagram all of the effects of reintroducing wolves back into Yellowstone. And it's absolutely fascinating because what they've found so this is a spoiler, by the way, what they've found is that reintroduction of the wolves have actually changed the courses of rivers. So a biological intervention has had a hydrogeological impact, and it's just absolutely fascinating, the impact of this one simple change to the ecosystem of Yellowstone National Park. Yeah? While we're on the theme of food webs, a lot of what we teach in terms of food webs are only a tiny part of the story. The green food webs, the most obvious parts of the food web that we can see, only constitutes about 10% of the flow of energy through an ecosystem. The other 90% comes from what is known as the brown food web. Okay? So the way to think about the brown and the green food web is, if this is the green food web because it's based upon animals eating living plant matter, if we have this as the green food web, so then what we'll have is, if the green food web is here, the brown food web is actually sitting behind. So as it's sitting behind the green food web, there are actually also connections in between. So it's a richly interconnected network of two sets of feeding relationships, one based on living plants, the other one based upon dead stuff and rotting stuff. Okay, so one of the primary organisms within the brown within the brown food web are the detritivores. So we had the herbivores, then we've got the omnivores, which eat both meat and plant, and then we've got the carnivores, who are meat specialists, and then we have the detritivores. They generally form either quaternary level consumers or quinternary level consumers, and their job is to recycle matter. So how earlier I was speaking about the food web shows the flow of energy through an ecosystem. So energy flows through an ecosystem and exits as heat. Okay? Matter, on the other hand, is actually cycled through an ecosystem. So what we're talking about there, things which get cycled are nitrogen, carbon, and oxygen. That's why we study those particular cycles, those matter cycles, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, which is essentially the oxygen cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. Now, there is the phosphorus, but it's not as interesting, and it's a little bit more difficult. So in terms of the nitrogen cycle, there are a number of really interesting case studies. Some of them from Australia, but there are also some overseas. So since time immemorial, humans have been studying the natural world and watching the cycles, the ebb and flow of the seasons, the ebb and flow as animals migrate, as plants bloom and flower and fruit, and then go into dormancy over a cold period of the month. So what you can see at the top there is Brewarrina fish traps. So the ancient Australians, they notice, oh wow, there's a whole bunch of fish which appear at this time of year when these certain stars are appearing, when that certain plant is flowering, when those animals are appearing. So they would know that at certain points of the river, fish would gather there. Now, so what they did was they built infrastructure around that to not only ramp up the numbers of fish that were able to reproduce and so forth, but then also so they could actually skim in a sustainable way the excess. So they take off most of the males, and release all the females to leave them to breed the next generation. So that wasn't only going on in Australia, that was also happening over in Canada. So in Canada, amongst the First Peoples, they have a first salmon ceremony. So they too would watch the seasons, they would watch the stars and the weather and the animals and the plants, and they would realise, oh, it's nearly time for the salmon to come back. So for people all around, Canada would actually congregate at rivers, they'd set up camps, reaffirm connections, and they too would skim off the excess salmon, leaving plenty of salmon for the cycle to continue. Over in the ancient Aztecs, they had things called those chinampas, or floating gardens. So they had these literally floating gardens, and a system of canals in between. So the system of canals allowed them to get easily from place to place, and once they had harvested, then moving the produce was easy, but also they would have fish and a whole other bunch of organisms producing waste in that water. That waste water was then used to water the gardens, providing a rich source of nutrients. Now this was taken to another level over in Asia, where they have integrated fish and rice farming. So, a rice farmer would allow fish to come in to his rice paddock. Now, certain types of fish, they didn't harm the rice, but were just going around eating all of the predaceous insects, eating insect larvae, eating the adults. As it ate those insects, it would poop out the waste in a nitrogen-rich format, and then it eventually be converted into a format that the plants could use. So it's win-win. So the fish get a free feed, the farmer gets to increase yield because the insects aren't eating it, and also he's able to skim off some of that fish as another protein source in their diet. Okay, so there's a number of cases where we've actually inserted ourselves into naturally occurring ecosystems, naturally occurring cycles of migration of fish in Australia and salmon over in the US, but then also realising and applying that knowledge ourselves in a really sophisticated way in those two examples down the bottom. Okay? Now, the whole point of salmon and eel migration is really fascinating because the ancient Australians and also the ancient Canadians, they realised the importance of that fish to the ecosystem, and modern knowledge of the ecosystems is really just starting to catch up. Now, in certain rivers in Australia and over in Canada, they're totem, so really super important animals or spirits. Well, in this case it was the eel and also the salmon was revered because of the ecological functions that it performed. So one of the main jobs of the fish and the eels was to get born in these freshwater bodies, go out to the ocean, grow and eat and collect all that nitrogen and carbon, and bring that as part of their bodies back up into land, into those terrestrial water bodies, into lakes and rivers, far inland. So then what would happen is that the bears would be waiting for them, the eagles would be waiting for them, we would be waiting for them. So we would get our pick at the salmon, but enough would actually get through to actually lay their eggs and produce the next generation. Now, all of that material, all of that waste from the bears and the eagles and us, we'd go and spread that in the forest. The dead and rotting bodies of the salmon that weren't wholly eaten would be eaten by, say, insects and flies and other scavengers, and their waste would actually be spread out as well. So there was an annual pulse of nitrogen into these forests, and what we're starting to realise now is that some of the struggles that the Canadian redwood forests are having are due to that annual nitrogen pulse not being present as we overfish salmon. And same thing with in Australia as well, with the eel migration into places like Parramatta not happening. We're also starting to see that the forests there are starting to suffer as well. Okay, so If you want to read more about how salmon and also eels contribute to nutrient cycling, then go ahead and watch these videos. Okay? So that's ecology. What we looked at in ecology was food webs and how to interpret and read those to make predictions about ecological impacts of removing or introducing organisms. Now what we're going to move on to is the cell portion of the syllabus. So what we're specifically going to have a look at is the cell theory. Okay, so the cell theory, like other theories, is an excellent demonstration of the nature of science, in that it is a collaborative effort of many scientists over time in developing these ideas by taking someone else's idea, conducting experiments, adding and tweaking to the idea, passing that on to another scientist. Okay? So it's a really good demonstration of that. Go ahead and watch this video and you'll be able to see some of the main characters in that. Now there are three main tenets to cell theory. The first one is that the cell is the basic unit of life. Now that is partly true. That is true. But the next part also adds really important information that living things are made up of cells, but also and their products. Yeah. So us, for example, we're made of cells, but then we're also made of things like hair and nails and other stuff as well. Okay. So organisms are made up of one or more cells and their products. So that would also include flagella, for example, or cilia as being another product. The third tenet of the cell theory is that all cells are produced by the division of pre-existing cells. So you can't just get cells just spontaneously appear out of nothing. That idea is known as spontaneous generation. And Virchow was the person who came up with that part of the theory. Okay? So that is the cell theory. Now, this is an important point because it really gets down to the division of content between, say, biology and the other sciences. Okay, so what you can see here is the divisions of biological organisation. So all the way down the bottom are atoms, and then you've got macromolecules and so forth and so forth. Yeah. Now up here is really the division between biology and biochemistry and chemistry. Okay, so above this line, the study of molecules and atoms, that's chemistry. Yeah. This grey area here, where we start looking at the molecules of life, that's the field called biochemistry, and then biology starts proper at the cell. Okay, so the cell is so critical to the definition of life that it actually is one of the defining features of how we define biology. Yeah? So you may study cells, then you would be known as a cytologist. If we get a bunch of cells together, the same type of cells, then we can form tissue. So epithelial cells here, forming layers of skin, that's a type of tissue. If you get a number of different tissue types together, then you'll have an organ. Okay, so for example, the lung, you might be a gastrologist. Okay, lung is not gastrologist. Gastrologist is stomach. Okay, so if you get a number of organs together, then that forms an organ system. Number of organ systems together, that forms an organism. Okay, so you might study particular types of organisms. So you might be an ornithologist, for example. Okay? If you study groups of organisms at the population level, then you are something. Then more than likely you to be a population biologist, and then communities, so forth, all the way up to biosphere. So that notion of ecologist probably comes all the way down to studies of population and so forth. Yeah. So there is the different levels of biological classification and how we get each one of those levels. Okay, rightio. Now, this is where you get to do a little bit of work and a little bit of independent research. Okay, now, so we've gone from cells. I'll just come back here. We've gone from cells to tissues, organs. Now this learning objective has you looking at organ systems. Okay? So as I was saying earlier before, a bunch of organ systems together form an organism. So we have an integumentary system, we have a skeletal system, we have a muscular system, and yada yada yada, all the way around. Okay? So a key concept in the study of anatomy, which is essentially what this is the understanding of structure and function. Okay? Now, depending upon your course, we will work on this collaboratively, or you might need to work on it yourself. Okay? So for your own benefit, what I'd like you to do is maybe just do the human digestive system. Okay? So the first step in completing this graphic organizer, this thinking tool, this tabular thinking tool, is to identify the organs within the digestive system. So you might want to start at one end and go all the way down to the other end. So you might mention mouth and teeth and tongue and salivary glands and so forth. Okay? So that's the first step. Fill out, identify as many organs as you can of that particular system. Once you've done that, then two key things you need to be able to do is describe the structure, so what's its size, shape and so forth, and also position in the system, because that's also related to its function. Yeah? And then also the function. Now, in terms of the digestive system, the various organs either have a digestive role, and that can either be chemical or physical digestion, and or a absorption role. Okay? Or a transportation role, or some other role, and I've listed them up here. Okay? So based upon the organs that you've listed over in the first column, describe their structures and then tell me what they do. And I've given you a bit of a hint here about the various things that you can write for the functions. Okay? Now, the human digestive system is the most popular system which is done out there in schools today. So you might want to focus on that one. Another popular one which is done out in schools is the cardiorespiratory system. So heart and lung and blood vessels and stuff. So you might want to do that one. Now the immune system is not done as often, but if you have extension students in your class and they are like, oh, sir, I'm all over the respiratory and digestive systems, can I have something harder? Then you might get them to do this one here, the human immune system. Then there are, I'm not sure that this one is done so much these days. There are some schools who will still do the male and the female reproductive systems. That's really just a school-based decision of whether that happens or not. But the same principle applies, that in anatomy, we identify the organs in particular, we describe their structure, and then we also describe their function in particular. Okay? Excellent. Okay, so that's anatomy. Now we're moving on to physiology. And in particular within physiology is this idea of homeostatic control. So when we have a look at the control systems within our body, we have a set point that when things go above or when they go below this set point, we have mechanisms within inside our body which bring us back to that straight and narrow, back to that normal level. Okay, so physiology is really the study of these systems, these chemical systems within our body, which are designed to maintain homeostatic control. Okay, so we can look at temperature, we can look at glucose, we can look at blood oxygen, but the example that we're going to have a look at here is temperature control. Now, a lot of these, well, all of these homeostatic controls operate by what's known as a negative feedback loop. Now, a fever is an example of a positive feedback loop, which just makes you hotter and hotter and hotter, and you know, pushes you off into the extreme in one direction, whereas a negative feedback loop brings your bodily systems back to a norm, back to a base level. Okay, so let's follow this around here. So you've got the names of the various things, the stimulus, sensor, control, and effector, but let's look at it in the context of body temperature. So it's an insanely hot day. You've been working out in the yard all day, no water, no sun covering, totally non-sun smart, and whoopsie, your body temperature now exceeds 37 degrees. Well, you've got nerve cells all around your body which detect your skin surface temperature, your internal temperature, and even your blood temperature. Yeah? So you've got a temperature sensor in, I think it's the carotid artery, just at the branch. I think there's a pressure sensor and a temperature sensor about here, and that sends signals to your brain about what your internal temperature is. Okay, so that sends a signal. Those nerve endings send a signal to your brain that say, "Hey, it's way too hot. Turn on systems which will bring our temperature back down." Okay, so that will affect things like sweat glands throughout your body to start releasing sweat, for example. You may start to feel lethargic if it gets that bad, yeah? Because by you moving around, you're generating heat, your body wants to lose heat, so it's going to make you feel lethargic, so you sit down and stop moving, yeah? The other thing is that you start to spread your body out, yeah? So your armpits and your groins are quite warm areas, so by opening those out, you can actually start to lose more heat as well. If we were dogs, we'd actually start to pant, for example. We would also start to seek out cool places, and we would naturally dig down into the dirt to create a bit of a hollow to make it a little bit cooler. And so that cessation of activity is quite a common way that animals try and reduce the internal body temperature. Okay? So by all of these systems kicking in, that then feeds back to our body temperature. So hopefully what it will do is lower the body temperature, these sensors stop firing so much, these parts of the brain stop sending out signals so much, and then hopefully you stop sweating, okay, as you start to cool down. So homeostatic control is where we deal with physiology. Okay? Rightio, moving on to the two last topics of this lecture. We're going to have a look at, firstly, at Mendelian genetics, which is quite different to molecular genetics, and we tend to pretty much do that in year 11 and 12. And then we're going to move on to the granddaddy of all theories in biology, theory of evolution by natural selection. But let's start with Mendel first. So Gregor Mendel, he was a monk, and he loved to garden. He loved to garden so much that he noticed that when he was growing his peas, that on a number of characteristics, there were only ever two possible characteristics that he could see. Yep. He called those phenotypes. So the characteristic that you can see, which is expressed, is called a phenotype. So for example, when he looked at the pods, you can either have full pods or constricted pods. You can have, and they can be yellow or green, not a mishmatch, not a checkered pattern. Okay, it'll either full on yellow or full on green. Same thing with flowers. He found the pea flowers, they were either white or they were violet. Nothing in between. Yeah? And so he started to realize that when he was looking at these particular characteristics, he started to realize, it looks like that one of these characteristics, whenever it's present, will always dominate over the other. Yeah? So that was the first thing that he noticed, okay? So it was the law of dominance, that when one characteristic was present, it would always dominate over another. So what he noticed was if he got a tall plant and a short plant and he crossed those two, the next generation would always be 100% tall plants. Nothing in between, no short plants, just all tall plants. So that was his first law. Now, for this to work mathematically, he realized that for each characteristic, each individual must have two versions of that gene, the gene which is then expressed to give you the phenotype. Yeah? So he noticed, so what he would write is that the tall gene is dominant over the short gene. Yeah, tall is dominant over the short gene, and the dominant allele we will give the capital letter, and the recessive allele we will give the lowercase letter. Okay, so for this to occur, all of the offspring to be big T, little t, and tall, he realized that the two versions of the genes that you have must be inherited independently of one another. Yeah? So from this parent, you can either get a big T or a big T. From this parent, you could get a little t or a little t. The situation is different in this case. So what we've got are two tall individuals, so their phenotype is tall, but when you look at their genotype, the genes that they're made up of, they've got a dominant and a recessive. This individual has a dominant and recessive. So when he crossed two tall plants, which what we call heterozygous, because they have two different genes, he noticed that you always get this ratio of phenotypes. 75% of them are tall, 25% of the offspring are short. The only way for that to happen is if over here, these alleles, these versions of the genes are inherited independently, okay? Oh, segregated. Yeah? And then the last principle that he talked about was independent assortment. Yeah? So when we start to look at dihybrid crosses, yeah, what we've got is here the gene for round, and also the gene for colour, pod colour. Yeah? So round seeds and pod colour. What he realised was that these two different characteristics, roundness and pod colour, they were sorted independently of one another. Okay? Excellent. So, based upon those three rules, what geneticists and what farmers and what animal breeders have been able to do is, well, for dominant recessive characteristics, is to be able to predict with a bit more certainty the characteristics that their offspring will have. Now, not all characteristics are dominant recessive. Not all characteristics are due to a single gene. Now, Mendel was just lucky that he chose to study peas, and peas have a lot of these dominant recessive genes. In more complex organisms, or just organisms more generally, the genetics is much, much more complicated than this. Now, just to give you an example, when I was in high school, it was commonly taught that brown eyes was dominant to blue eyes, recessive. Now, that's kind of true, but not really, yeah? Because it is, firstly, it's not a dominant recessive relationship. And secondly, there are many, many different types of, well, not many, many, but there are a variety of different eye colours, not just brown eyes and blue eyes. There's hazel, there's green, there's grey, and then there's a whole variety in between. I think it's like something like 8 genes are responsible for eye colour. Yeah? So when you use eye colour in your class, don't talk about this being true in humans, because it's not. Yeah? Now, what you see here are a whole bunch of Punnett squares that I'd like you to have a go. Now, I'm going to talk you through the first 2 crosses, and then I want you to have a go at doing the next 4, okay? So, in this first example, we've got a brown-eyed parent, so 2 dominant genes, homozygous. 2 dominant genes, homozygous dominant, yeah? So, when you cross a brown parent with a brown parent, you strangely get all brown-eyed children, yeah? Same thing with blue eyes, yeah? So a blue-eyed parent and a blue-eyed parent, when we cross those, see how the only possible genes that can be inherited are the recessive blue-eyed gene. So that means all the children must be blue-eyed, okay? Now, if you want to have a go at the rest of these Punnett squares without me revealing them, okay, let's pause now, have a go, and then you can come back and check. Okay? So, if you've paused, here are those answers. See how you went, okay? Now, if you had problems with these, please bring them to a workshop or tutorial, and then I can explain more what's going on. Excellent. Okay, last topic for this lecture, the theory of evolution by natural selection. Now, the theory of evolution really is part of a much, much longer process that we humans have been going through. And one of the big questions that we've always asked is, where did we come from? Okay? Kind of related to that is when we look out across the world, we see plants and animals and we see a great diversity. So really, this idea of trying to explain the diversity of life on Earth really just was started long, long ago. Yeah. So the Australian Indigenous cultures, they explain the diversity in terms of the creative dreamtime spirits that travel the landscape, making landforms, rivers, lakes, but also the land, the animals, and the people. Within the Judeo-Christian heritage, we have the Genesis creation story. So Garden of Eden, 7-day creation, and so forth. In Hindu culture, they talk about Lord Brahma and his various body parts breaking off or being chopped up and becoming the variety of living things. Okay? So really, Darwin's attempt to explain all of this, how all of this came about, was really started long, long ago, and it was dealt with more so in the field of religion and philosophy, whereas this was one of the first attempts, and probably the most successful attempts, at describing the diversity of life. Okay? So when we go back to Darwin's time, it was really a crazy time in the UK and also in Europe, because when he looked around, he noticed that oh boy, there are a truckload of dogs out there. Yeah, there are big dogs, there are little dogs. Same thing with cats. There are some hairless cats, there are some friendly cats, there's some big cats, there's some small cats, there's ferocious cats, and same thing with cattle and pigeons. Pigeons is especially exciting in Darwin's time because pigeon fanciers would really, really ramp up these characteristics of the pigeons, and so they'd have these crazy chests and feathers on their feet and totally impractical for flying. But what's common to all of these is that what was doing the selecting was human desire and need. So for example, we want cows with more milk, so what we do is we get two parents of high producing milk and mate those together, and we would produce the next generation. From that next generation, select the best milk producers, breed those, produce another generation. Okay? So what this is called is artificial selection, and the selective pressure here is the human desire or need. So for example, we want cute dogs that can fit on our lap, so we just breed and breed over generations, cuter and fluffier and friendlier. Not in the case of chihuahuas. Dogs until we get the desired animal. Okay? Same thing with cats. We bred and bred and bred. So for example, coat color or size or ferociousness or hunting ability. We did the same thing with cats, pigeons, and cows. Not only did we do this to animals, but we've been doing this for plants probably just as long. So this example here is the wild mustard plant, or the brassica. So the genus Brassica has given rise to a whole heap of really good edible plants and is one of the darlings of plant genetic research. Anywho, the wild mustard plant kind of looked like that. Yeah? Wasn't really anything to write home about. However, with selective breeding over generations and generations, what we're able to do is dial up some characteristics and dial down others. So when we dial up the leaves of these wild mustard plants, then we get kale. Yeah? If we dial up other aspects, the stem, then we get kohlrabi. If we dial up and we make our focus, the flower buds, then we get cauliflower. So you can see a range of different vegetables actually came from the one ancestor plant. And we've been doing this forever. So for example, up here, this is the ancestor of the watermelon. Tiny, tiny little things, not much flesh, not very sweet. selective breeding over millennia has produced this monster here. And we've even gone so far as to make them waterless. This here is the old banana, so kind of tiny, very starchy, massive, massive seeds. Through breeding, we've produced, well, the green banana, but then also this Cavendish banana, the yellow ripening banana as well. So much bigger in size. The seeds have been reduced to tiny points and very, very sweet. Same thing with eggplant, this into this monster. Carrots have gone from this little weedy little root structure to this monster here, and in fact will come in different colors. And over in South America they bred this corn or maize. Yeah. Now it went from this structure here, this tiny little structure, into this monster over here. And what's even more interesting about this example is the structure that was later to become these, virtually, well, not microscopic, but tiny. They're really not that obvious on the ancestor of corn and maize, but through selective breeding, we've been able to turn it into this. Okay, so humans have really just taken what has occurred naturally, where the environment does the selecting, and we've hijacked that for our own purposes, to create cute lapdogs, to create meatier cows, to create strokeable cats, and fancy pigeons, okay? And nice, delicious food, okay? Rightio, so let's now have a look at the major tenets that Darwin came up with. The first one, for evolution to occur, we need to have variation within the population. The more variation, the better. Now, the reason why variation is so good is that if the environment changes to better suit other individuals of different characteristics, then they will survive and then produce the next generation. Okay? And what's lucky is that we vary on every single characteristic. We vary in anatomical features, we vary in physiological characteristics, we also vary in terms of behaviour. So anything which has variation is subjectable to evolution, because the environment can select for individuals of particular characteristics. The other thing that you need for evolution to occur is competition, and competition for resources. So not only do we compete for resources, but we also compete for space, and we also compete for mates as well. So competition in any one of these areas, for example, feeding. Okay? So if we've got bigger, sharper teeth, we're able to catch more prey. Catching more prey means that we have more energy for reproduction and growth and so forth. So we need to be able to, there to be competition for a limited set of resources within the environment. And the other thing that you need is heritability, some way for the characteristics in the parent to be passed on to the offspring. Now, Darwin didn't actually know what that mechanism was, how information was passed, information of characteristics was passed from parent to offspring, but he made a prediction. He said that at some point in the future we will discover this mechanism. Well, it took about 100 years for Watson and Crick to come along later and say, well, actually that molecule is DNA. Okay, so it was a great vindication of his original ideas. So when we talk about the survival of the fittest, what we're really talking about is individuals with advantageous characteristics outcompete. Now, that's an important point that we'll get to, because when we talk about outcompete individuals of less advantageous characteristics, we're actually talking about the ability to produce offspring. Yeah? So in the game of evolution, whoever produces the most offspring is the winner. It's not necessarily the fittest, because sometimes the advantageous characteristic is not moving around. So for example, like the sloth, they have evolved because their diet is so nutrient poor, it's actually advantageous for them not to move around so much. Hence their slow motion. Same thing with koalas. They have evolved because there's not many calories in eucalyptus leaves, they too have evolved to be slow. So it's not necessarily the fittest, but the one with the most advantageous characteristics. Okay? And so over time, these advantageous characteristics become more common in the population. So rabbits become faster, koalas become slower, humans become smarter, and a whole range of other characteristics and different examples. Okay? It's all about the advantageous characteristics conferring an advantage to the individual in terms of space, competition for resources. They're able to collect more, and because they're able to collect more resources, they're able to produce more offspring, which is the whole point of evolution. Yeah? So where does the evidence for evolution comes from? Well, it comes from everywhere. Yeah? So from the fossil record, from transitional species, homologous structures. Homologous structures, the ones that you can see there are the forearm. So you've got the humerus, the radius and the ulna, the carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. And you can see there that over time, that forearm has been adapted and evolved to suit different characteristics. So in cats, that forearm, it was more advantageous for them to have it as a running limb, whereas for us, it's more of a tool handling limb. For whales, it was more advantageous for their front limb to become a flipper, elongation of the carpals and metacarpals. So not carpals, metacarpals. And in the bats, the same thing. So it was more advantageous for bats to have long fingers that webbing could be strung in between for their wings. So there's a whole range of evidence. Actually, nothing in biology actually contradicts the idea of natural selection, insofar that Dobzhansky, he said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, and that's so true. There is nothing within biology which actually contradicts evolution by natural selection. If you want to read more about natural selection, do go ahead and check out these videos here. So there's one by Kurzgesagt and also one by Crash Course. So Crash Course should be one of your go-to YouTube channels well, for any area. Yeah? So here are our learning objectives for this particular lecture. We looked at classification, we looked at some ecology and also some cells. Then we had a look at some anatomy, structure and function of human organ systems. I want you to do digestive. Then we did some physiology by looking at negative feedback loops. We had a look at some Mendelian genetics and using Punnett squares to make predictions about the genotypic and phenotypic ratios of offspring. And then we had a very quick look at the theory of evolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Recording has stopped.
Ah!